Welcome, everyone. And to start off, my name is Bill Coleman, and I'm a consultant to the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Adrienne Furness, who is the president of the Benton Institute.
So you want me to give my presentation now, Bill?
Well, a little welcome and then jump right in. Yes.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks, Bill, and good day to all of our attendees. Yes, I'm the executive director of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, and I'm so pleased to run this program in partnership with the state of Illinois. So I know we had our kickoff already, but Bill has asked me to perhaps take a step back and give you all a broad overview of broadband access, adoption, and usage, and set the stage for the rest of today's agenda. So I wanted to start with some basics. I'm sure that many of you know a lot of what is on the next slide. Thank you, Robbie. But I thought what we would do is spend a little bit of time making sure that we know what broadband is. And it does refer to to the internet, and it's shorthand for an always-on high-speed connection provided by what's called an internet service provider. And so we say always on to differentiate contemporary broadband connections from those of the 1990s, when a user had to dial a telephone number through their computer to connect. So I happen to be old enough to remember those days. I'm not sure the rest of you are, but we're now currently can get broadband 6 different ways. And we're going to focus on the bottom tier. It's what we call wireline or fixed broadband, meaning a wire delivers service into a home or business. Now, when we talk about broadband, speed is very important because we're really getting to the capacity of a connection to handle more and more of our digital lives. And as many of you may know, the federal agency charged with regulating telecommunications, it's called the Federal Communications Commission, has not updated the speed benchmark for broadband in over 5 years. And this speed is inadequate for multiple people in the same household to use video conferencing tools for work and school at the same time, which is something that we learned this past 1.5 years when we were all at home. Now, there are a wide variety of speeds available. If you subscribe to broadband through a cable company such as Comcast, which is what I have at my home, and these are Comcast is mostly available in high density urban areas, most of you would be getting 4 times the speed set up by the Federal Communications Commission, and that's 25 megabits down and 3 up. So let's be clear that not all broadband is created equal. Fiber is the gold standard of broadband connections, and it's incredibly fast and can handle a near unlimited amount of data and users. But the problem, and this is a problem for deploying all wireline broadband networks, is that it is expensive to lay down. And as such, many companies don't want to invest in deployment without a guaranteed return on investment. And that's something that can be difficult to achieve, as many of you know, in rural America. So we at the Benton Institute don't advocate for broadband as an end in itself. Instead, we say that the transformative power of broadband lies in its ability to connect users to solutions. So it's about broadband's promise to deliver education, healthcare, economic equality, and civic engagement to everybody. And it's this promise and our failure to deliver on it that has been made even more apparent during the pandemic. Next slide, Robbie. So you've seen a load of these pictures over the last year and a half, but I do think that these 3 pictures are worth 1,000 words. At the top right is a family in rural Georgia, and they do drive 20 miles each way to access Wi-Fi at the Chick-fil-A so that 4 kids in this van with their laptops can do their homework. And then in the lower right, you have a student in Las Vegas who is doing his coursework thanks to a bus providing Wi-Fi. And there was a lot of that going on in areas that did not have access to fixed broadband. And then finally on the left, there's this family on Golden Pond in New Hampshire struggling with internet connectivity. So you would look at those pictures and you might ask, no, it's all right, Robbie, you can go to the next slide. Whose job is it to deliver broadband to everyone in the US? And is it the job of a private internet service provider that's focused on shareholder return? Is it the job of the government? Or is it some combination, some public-private combination? So I want to talk a little bit about universal service. These are principles that are enshrined in federal laws that go back to 1934, and it was re-articulated again in 1996. So these laws outline principles that guide universal service policy, and they provided a variety of programs and funding mechanisms to help ensure that networks reached everywhere, that schools, libraries, and rural healthcare facilities can connect, and that the most vulnerable low-income households can afford service. So there are a lot of people, including at Benton, at the federal, state, and local level, who feel it is their job to promote and uphold the principles that guide universal service. So the question you may be asking is, if these principles have been around for decades, why haven't we solved these problems? And so I think we have, to a degree. Phone service, of course, the dominant technology of the last 100 years, is now nearly ubiquitous. I think it's 97 or 98% of people in the United States have access to phone service. But as we introduce new technologies, sometimes the crush of new societal challenges means it sometimes feels like we're going 1 step forward and 2 steps back. So nearly after 2.5 decades of broadband, we still find it's unavailable or unaffordable for millions of Americans. Next slide, Robbie. So this is a very, I think, telling slide. On the left, you'd see then, and you'd ask yourself, there are 14.5 million people who don't have access at home, meaning they don't have a wire or even any of the services I described that would bring them broadband. But on the other side of this chart, you'd ask yourself, this is 120 million people. That's about 36% of the country who do not use the internet at broadband speeds greater than or equal to the federal benchmark that defines broadband. So what's the state of this digital divide in the United States? So for some, there is no broadband network available to them at any price, as shown on the left. In too many areas, commercial providers have determined that there's just not enough return on investment to build. But most often, people assume that this is a problem in less densely populated rural areas. And that's true with about 16% of people who lack access to fixed broadband. But less than half of households on rural tribal lands have access to fixed broadband. Next slide, Robbie. But let's not think that all urbanites have broadband either, as many of you know. From a sheer numbers perspective, there are almost 3 times as many people without broadband in urban or metro areas than in rural areas. And the key issue is cost. The price that US consumers pay for broadband is the 3rd highest in the world. And for really low income households, Benton's research shows that $10 to $15 per month is the most that low income households can afford to pay for broadband without sacrificing other necessities. About 37% of non-broadband users cite the cost of a computer as one of the reasons they do not have broadband at home. And it might surprise you to know that in Illinois, 1.1 million people do not have a computer at home. And that's, to me, a startling number. Communities of color, low income, and rural Americans are far more likely not to use broadband than are whites and people with higher incomes. Robbie, next slide. So there's more to the digital divide than access and cost. 1/3 of people who don't subscribe to broadband say they lack the skills like setting up an email account or installing security measures. And so one has to ask oneself, if you're sitting in a community, a city or a state, with racial and geographic disparities in health and economic status, whether you face a stark decision. Should broadband become just another marker of racial and geographic inequity, or should we make the choice to support and empower low-income communities, rural and tribal areas through equal access to affordable broadband and the skills to use it? So this is a slide that lays out at least 2 of the 3 legs of the stool that we like to address in the ICC program, access and adoption. But without these 2 things, you don't get to the use part of it, how you use broadband in all of the ways that, or that sophistication of use that Bill likes to talk about. That allows you to address some of your community needs like healthcare, education, and work from home. This is an historic moment with the pandemic. Our efforts are needed more than ever to assure that we achieve digital equity. And that starts with building better broadband networks in communities, and that's why you all are here. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the high cost of communities being offline. And as I'll show later, the federal government has already deployed and is about to deploy billions more dollars to address the problem. But people in communities do need additional resources to shape these dollars and to plan long-term to ensure that their interests are represented in the discussion. And this is what the Benton Institute, why we exist, is to make sure that we're giving communities the resources. So we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And we like to say about ourselves that our work has taken the long view, and we actually have helped envision a public interest focused broadband policy agenda that champions fast, fair, open broadband for all. And we wrote this report called Broadband for America Now in 2020 to urge policymakers to start addressing at-home internet access as a civil rights emergency in need of a comprehensive solution. And we proposed an integrated strategy which articulated the need for leaders at all levels of government to embrace 4 building blocks of policy to close the digital divide. And they are digital equity, deployment or access, competition, which would of course lower prices and improve service. And then we stress the importance of community leaders and community anchor institutions in this equation. And as you all are forming your steering teams, of course, you're looking to pull in members of your community that represent these community anchors that can be so important in this fight. Next slide, Robbie. So we like to say that on this, the importance of broadband, President Biden and Benton agree that we can't build back better without broadband. So as many of you may remember, during his presidential campaign, Biden articulated 4 policy priorities, obviously battling COVID-19, pushing for economic recovery, striving for racial equity, and fighting climate change. And so what I liked about his agenda was that he articulated that broadband has a role in each of these areas. And so again, this is how we get to the use part of our 3-legged stool. So whether it's delivering telehealth for COVID, jobs through construction of networks as part of an infrastructure package, digital literacy training and affordability to close the digital equity gap, which disproportionately affects rural and tribal areas and communities of color, or whether it's putting forth applications for farmers to more sustainably manage their land and inputs and outputs, or for cities to implement smart grid technology. You could see how broadband plays a role in all of these goals of this administration. Next slide, Robbie. So we talk a lot and we throw a lot around a lot of acronyms in the broadband world, but for you all, you obviously have heard of the Federal Communications Commission. This is an independent regulatory agency, but there are other executive departments that deal with broadband, and you're going to be hearing more about a lot of these over the course of the next year. So there's the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration that has introduced some broadband funding programs that I'll talk about in a second. The U.S. Department of Agriculture spends a lot of time thinking about broadband in rural areas and broadband to farmers. And then recently, the U.S. Department of Treasury has announced a $10 billion program. So Robbie, next slide. This is a lot of information to absorb, but you obviously, some of you, particularly in schools, were utilizing CARES Act funds to help buy devices and make sure that you had a one-on-one, the ability to do one-on-one learning. There was the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which introduced the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. This was from the Federal Communications Commission and provides that $50 discount on broadband service. And then these 3 programs from the NTIA. One, it's $1 billion for tribal broadband connectivity. There's a program for broadband infrastructure deployment in unconnected areas. And then now recently rolling out a Connecting Minority Communications pilot program. And then, of course, I mentioned the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, which is also putting forth billions of dollars, mostly for infrastructure. Next slide, Robbie. So Benton likes to emphasize that there's a real connection between state, local, and federal efforts. And we think the best thing to do is have federal funding fused with more trusted state, tribal, and local leadership, because it's all of you on the ground that have a better understanding of your political and economic environments, your health threats, your resource levels, and your broadband usage needs. Plus, you're the ones that are going to start making relationships with your local internet service providers. And states are finding innovative and creative ways to advance their broadband goals. And they're stepping up with comprehensive approaches that include funding and stakeholder outreach, capacity building, program evaluation, and partnerships. And as you can see on the lower left here, the announcement from 2019 about the $400 million. I think this actually says 420, but 20 million goes to the Illinois Century Network, and the other 400 million is meant to be bringing infrastructure to all parts of Illinois. Thank you, Robbie. Great. And then there's this infrastructure bill that we just keep our fingers crossed is going to get passed, those of us in the broadband world, because there's 65 billion available to ensure universal high-speed internet access. And of that 65 billion, 42 of it is going to pass through that Department of Commerce department, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, just call it NTIA, and it's going directly to the states for broadband expansion. So as I said, you're actually really lucky you live in Illinois, because it's in comparison to a lot of other states, it's organized to receive these funds and has gotten a head start with the program that you all are, some of you may be interested in applying for. It Connect Illinois, and it has some of these digital equity programs already in place. So we always say that infrastructure grants are and will be available, but communities need to be ready to apply. And how are they going to get ready unless they undergo a community engagement and planning process that sets your goals and the goals of local internet service providers? We don't want them, the internet service providers, to set those goals for you. We want you to set them so you're ready to get into discussions with them and push the things that you want as you negotiate, for instance, like a low income tier of service or serving the entire community. It's the reason we started the Illinois Connected Communities program, and it's why we're here today. So it's important to empower users to make the most of their connections, to utilize broadband as a gateway, or as my lawyer friends like to say, a condition precedent to individual opportunity and to forming strong local communities. So I love this quote in conclusion. The tragedies that have unfolded since March 2020 have only increased our resolve that universal and affordable high performance broadband is more than a goal. It's a necessity for people to survive and thrive in the 21st century. And the strength of high performance broadband is that it will, if fully accessible to all people in the United States, help solve some of our most critical challenges and help people overcome key barriers regardless of where they live and who they are. So we do like saying, and Robbie, you can go to the next slide, that we need to start addressing at-home internet access, not as just a troubling issue, but as a civil rights emergency in need of a comprehensive solution. And we ask for broadband for America now, since our current crisis demands it. And thanks, Bill, for letting me maybe proselytize a little bit. You know, we've been in the business for, as I said, 40 years, and it is our mantra that this is a utility that should be brought to everybody. And I'm so happy to welcome again the second cohort of Illinois Connected Communities and turn it back to you to proceed with the agenda. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Adrienne. And now we're going to go to Adrienne Pickett, who is one of our fellows that's joining us from the Office of Broadband. Adrienne's going to lead a little exercise just to get everyone participating in the program and think about what are your community's priorities for the Illinois Connected Communities program. So Adrienne, take it away.
Great, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Adrienne, for that awesome introduction to what we'll be talking about today. So I want to share with you all this Jamboard that I've created and that I'd like for all of us to fill in. So I'm going to share with you all this link. I'll put it in the chat box so that everyone should be able to access it, but let me know if for some reason you can't. Oops. I should probably share my screen too. So let me.
Adrian, this is Shubeka, and I just wanted to check the permissions because it is asking me to send a request for access. So maybe just make it public access if you can.
Ah, okay, thank you. Anyone with the link? There we go. Sorry about that. Great. It looks like people can access it now. Thank you, Shabika. And I'll go ahead and share my screen as well. If I can figure out the settings. But is that something, Robbie, that you can assist with?
Yeah, I'm trying to see.
Okay.
I'm trying to make sure you've got.
So what you'll see when you access the Jamboard is there are 3 different columns for access, adoption, and use. And so in thinking about your different communities and the goals for digital, whether it's digital learning or it's digital access, digital use, go ahead and start using some of the stickies, sort of the same way I did, the sticky notes that are on your left-hand side, and just write a little bit about what your goals are in terms of access or adoption or use. And let's just fill up the board as much as we possibly can. So
Adrienne,
that,
could you demonstrate how to do that?
absolutely. I'd like to share my screen. I'm doing it now. Good, awesome, thank you. So here on my left-hand side, I'm clicking on a sticky note. And for adoption, I want to conduct a Skype business workshop. Okay, so I save it and put it under adoption. Okay, so
Adrienne, I think we only have view only. I think you need to further adjust the settings to edit.
okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay. This is all about use and all the fears and learning that go along with increasing our ability to use these tools.
Very, very good. Okay, so.
Is it helpful for me to share my screen for everybody, or is that all
Viewer,
right?
editor. Okay, so now you are all editors. Or you should be now. Let me know if that's not the case.
So I'm going to go back and click on the
Have to go back and click.
chat one more time, I think.
Okay.
There we go. Oop.
Is this you, Robbie, sharing your screen?
Sorry, I muted. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
So I just demonstrated if people do have access and want to,
Okay.
you can go over here to that sticky note, and kind of create a little thing and add it somewhere.
Perfect.
Oh, somebody did it. There we go.
Yep,
There we
people
go.
are doing it now. Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yay, we figured it out.
So as you think about your priorities with your community, you might think about making sure that everyone has broadband internet service in what I see west of Route 47, which I think is our McHenry County folks. And then the idea of adoption. Do you have a particular demographic, people who live in a housing complex or people who live in a neighborhood, younger people, older people, veterans? Those are all kind of things you think, what are our priorities? What have you been thinking about as you go? So thank you. Looks like everyone's on their way.
Yeah.
And people can also, if this is confusing, you can also just put in the chat anything that might be a community priority, and we can kind of take those and add to it.
There are a couple of things in the chat that have come up from James.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Perfect, thanks.
It's great to see sticky notes in all three of our sectors there. It's really helpful to think of this access, adoption, and use model as being mutually reinforcing. That if you have good internet, people make use of it, there'll be more internet. If there's more people adopt, then it's easier to get neighbors to adopt if some people in a housing complex have broadband and make use of it. Good. Any last thoughts?
James, when you say training for use, did you have a specific kind of training in mind?
Lean more towards job training. Training as far as any type of a job, and or near the community.
Okay.
Good. Well, Adrienne, thanks for demonstrating this tool. I think it's really fun, and I've just started really making use of it. So even old dogs can learn new tricks, and really excited to see kind of the thoughts of the community people. Will you capture that and save that so we can keep it?
Yes, absolutely. I'll go ahead and save it. Thank you, everyone.
Good. This is really great. I think it really sets the conversation. Over the next while now, we're gonna, let's see here, I'm gonna go into a little more detail on Broadband 101. Robbie's gonna pull up my presentation there and share his screen.
Just a second. I had everything up and now, okay, hold on. Okay. Yes.
Yep, let's get to the front page though.
Oh, hold on. There we go.
There we go. Good. Thanks, everyone. It's my job today to talk a little bit about Broadband 101. And we're going to dive in a little bit deeper than Adrienne talked about, but we're going to not too technical, so it's not going to scare anyone away. There won't be a test. And it's fun in these programs as we work with communities from the very start, where communities begin with their knowledge level to by the end of the program, their communities members are slinging the lingo with the best of them. So we really appreciate that. You can go to the next one, Robbie. So broadband development process, it's really interesting that communities have had to become expert in broadband. If everything was well with the world, we'd all just have broadband service. The providers would have invested. In the 1990s, we switched from this regulated telecommunications model into the more competitive model. And the idea is that, well, if we only had competition, the private sector would jump in and invest, and we'd have competitive networks everywhere. But really, the real story is that in many places, the private sector just isn't interested in building competitive networks in rural places. The markets are, the terrain is difficult. People are spread out, not nearly enough people per mile to make a competitive business case to attract private capital into the marketplace and to build those networks. So it'd be great if it was a poor broadband, you work a little bit and get great broadband, but really the development process is really this next slide, much more detailed, that community leaders join a program like ICC or go to a conference, or elected officials stand in the grocery store lines and have residents talk to them about the need for better broadband and why the government should be involved in that. Many times it's a personal story, that things are fine until you become impacted by the lack of broadband yourself. And I know that one elected official here in Minnesota in particular, he always thought broadband was kind of a secondary issue until it turned out that his grandchildren could not go to school from their home. And so during the COVID pandemic, and so suddenly they're at his house doing their homework, their schoolwork, and he saw the real impact. We know that gathering data from public broadband data sources, maps, we're going to see some of that here in a little while. Learn about how other communities have solved the programs, community meetings, surveys, interview existing providers, and then moving on to determine what role your community is really willing to take. And that goes all the way from counties and communities saying, hey, this is a private sector activity, we're just going to wait and try and encourage people to do something, all the way to local government saying, we're going to build our own network and make sure that our problem is taken care of. So that takes a lot of conversation within the community. And we think a lot of that will happen through this ICC program. Understanding what your existing providers are ready to do many times in rural places, they just love one good network. We're not necessarily thinking about competitive networks. So if that existing provider can be motivated to improve services, improve the infrastructure, many times that is the easiest course. But many times we have to go find new provider partners. And so that involves trying to attract them to your community, just as a trying to attract any kind of economic development investment to your area. You need good data and information, and you need to be able to make the case to those internet service providers that they can make the case in your community. And then identify that provider and try and cut the deal. So in some communities, I've seen this happen in 90 to 120 days, where they're able to move forward quickly and find a provider partner. Maybe a provider who's just right next door now wants to move into your community. Other communities might struggle for 18 months, 2 years, or even 5 or 10 years, trying to get some combination of political will and financing and an interesting provider. Next slide, Robbie. When we think about broadband, many times we think about the download speed. How fast is our internet going to be to bring things from the internet into our homes or business? And so we know, as Adrienne talked, the state or the FCC definition of broadband is 25 megabits down. State goal in Illinois is 100 megabits down. And so thinking about that, the FCC definition hasn't moved in some time. But what we've also learned in the pandemic, and that what many of us have always known, is that upload speed is really the economic development side. That's the production side, people creating and sharing content from their computers. And so we know that the upload speed is really important. One of the beautiful things about fiber optics I'll talk about later is that it really supports high speed up and down, where the other technologies are generally more limited on the upload speed. Once you have internet, people say, well, can we afford it? How do we make it more affordable? Competition is one way to do that, having local government involvement and either through provision and so on. But we've also seen the providers step up in some cases with pretty good affordability programs. Now the FCC in the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program has brought federal dollars to that on at least a temporary basis. We think that that will be an ongoing kind of activity, but we'll have to see about that. One thing we know now is that people need to learn about that affordability program in order to access it. Once you have it and can afford it, then reliability becomes important as you come to rely on it for home businesses, for working from home, for doing school from home. And so the idea that, if your network is down for a moment, that's not too bad. If it's down for days at a time on a regular basis, that can really set people behind. And we know that doing surveys of students, there are students there where their service just is not reliable, and they're not able to fulfill their duties as students. Latency is something that comes into play, especially with satellite service, less so with the new satellite services that we're seeing with the Starlink, but that's a big issue. If your service is slow and connecting back and forth between the devices on the network, some of those applications won't work. And so that becomes a real challenge, again, especially for video services and people working on corporate networks. And then finally, we all know that mobility is an important thing now. People carry around a phone, they carry around iPads, laptops. They want to be able to connect anywhere, anytime. And so having those networks in place, usually Wi-Fi or cellular, are really important there. Next. So the question, wired or wireless, the answer is really both. We want to make sure that we can have that mobile service, but we know that for regular home use, for big downloads, for uploading to the cloud with your Dropbox text or video services and so on, a wired connection is really important. But again, that wireless is also important. So we want it all. Next. So as we think about really a deep dive into the technology, what's the right technology mix to achieve your community vision? And that's what our program is really about. Next. So here's the same slide that Adrienne had. Robbie liked it so much, he encouraged me to use it, and I do like it. I think it's a good primer, but we're going to talk about all these technologies now. Next. So I'm going to start kind of from up in the air, the farthest to the closest. And so satellite, we now have really two kinds of satellite services that are essentially completely different. Old-fashioned satellites is geosynchronous, just a few satellites above North America that serve the entire continent. And those stay exactly in the same spot over the Earth. They're traveling at the same speed that the Earth is revolving. So your satellite is your satellite. The problem is, to do that, they have to be so high and so far away that there's a big delay. The latency is high, which really precludes using them from corporate networks or doing Zoom calls, kind of Skype phone calls, because it becomes more like a two-way radio. My slide here says that the speeds max out at this 25.3, but I just was seeing the other day, and I need to update this, where they now offer services, they say up to 100 megabits per second, which is pretty fast. But one of the issues with that is that very low data caps with the satellite. People now are using almost 500 gigabytes of data a month with general household use of technology. And so if you're playing on any of these wireless plans, whether that's cellular or satellite, you know, if your cap is at 20, 30, 50 gigabytes, that's really going to inhibit how you use the service. In contrast, now we have this low Earth orbit. Essentially, what's now called Starlink is the brand name for this, but there might be other providers coming on board soon. But many satellites crossing the sky, but they're only about 350 miles up. So the latency is much better, approximately 60 milliseconds, as opposed to 600 with the other satellite. The speeds are much better, averaging up to 100 down and 14 up, no data caps. Right now, Starlink is just leaving beta services, which essentially means testing. Don't blame us if it doesn't work. So it's a limited number of customers trying out this new technology. And so we'll have to see what happens when more people sign on. It's $500 to get the equipment. It's $100 a month. Well, many families in America don't have $500 in the bank. And if that's all they have, they might not use it for broadband, although the kids might want them to. And so it's going to be a real question mark about how this low Earth orbit satellite systems really impact the national broadband marketplace. Next. On the fixed wireless, we know that what we've seen is fiber-fed towers out in the countryside. These can deliver services 7 to 10 miles out. And so they can now, if they're connected by fiber optic, each tower, you can get 100 megabits down and 50 up, which is a very good internet service for many people. But we know if you're out there at that 7 to 10 mile range, you're not going to get those highest speeds. Many of these wireless companies, they're kind of mom and pop string and can wireless. Instead of having fiber connected towers, they might have one connection to the internet, to the wired internet, and then go from tower to tower to tower with wireless radios. But each one of those hops, they call it, from tower to tower, slows the speeds and adds latency. So you have to know which kind of provider you're dealing with. This is a great model. Sometimes governments will put in fiber networks that connect fiber county buildings around a county. If they own that network, they can then attract an ISP, a WISP, a wireless ISP, to come onto their network and use that fiber backbone. And that's a great way, a kind of an interim solution. We think about that sometimes. Key factors in wireless is many times that requires a line of sight requirement, that your radio on your house has to be able to see the radio on the tower. Doesn't go through trees very well, especially pine trees. It doesn't go over hills and into valleys. One of the complicating things about wireless is the spectrum. And so that's the frequencies that are allocated for that kind of broadband service. Some of those are licensed that people own, like the especially cellular data, cellular services. So those have their frequencies. Television channels have their frequencies, all licensed. So no one can really interfere with that. Wi-Fi is totally unlicensed. And so if you have live in an apartment building and everyone's got a Wi-Fi router, each hitting each other, there's going to be a lot of interference there. And so there's some new unlicensed spectrum or lightly licensed spectrum that is called CBRS. That is traditionally been school spectrum. That's a kind of a game changer. That's more of a first come, first served on the spectrum allocation. So that's opened up a lot of new spectrum, which is really going to help wireless broadband. And then finally, emerging trends. T-Mobile and others have been marketing their cellular home service. It's essentially fixed wireless. And so if you can get that service, it's $50 per month and 75 to 100 megabit service. Again, the shared spectrum through CBRS. And then one thing we've also seen in urban areas, we've seen this, is fixed wireless backhaul, essentially wireless fiber connection to a building, and then distributing those services throughout the apartment building. And you can bypass your existing providers like AT&T or Comcast. Sometimes that wiring of the buildings internally is expensive, depending on if that building is all concrete. That can be a lot of drilling and so on. And so that can be a challenge, but we've seen companies like that provide some very affordable broadband service for lower income families, as well as affordable for higher, a wealthier demographic that is in place. So fixed wireless is something that has a lot of potential for many different uses. You can deploy it quickly, you can deploy it relatively inexpensively, and so that's a game changer. Again, it doesn't come anywhere close to fiber in terms of the speeds and availability. Next. And then wired technology, a fiber to the X is what they call that. Fiber to the home. Sometimes providers just go to the curb and then use the old wires, sometimes to the node, which is in a neighborhood. Ultimately, it's all fiber to the radio, to your Wi-Fi radio, or to the cell tower, or to the fixed wireless tower. But we know now that their services are up to 10 gigabits of service, so 10,000 megabits. Very low operating expense once you have fiber installed. It's got a long life, up to 50 years. You can have multiple internet service providers over one open access network. So if a government creates a network, they own the network, they can essentially allow multiple providers to come in and provide competitive service over that network. That's a real game changer in terms of pricing and customer service. And then there you might hear about passive optical networks, which means that out in the field they split the signal up, but they're really using mirrors and so on. So no electronics out in the field, which makes it very low maintenance. The other model is to use Ethernet technology, just like a network of computers in a workplace are Ethernet. But the difference is that each house, or let's just say for a business park, they can use Ethernet technology which has individual fibers for each business or each customer. And so those are two very different technologies, but many providers use multiple providers. More traditionally, we've seen fiber hybrid solutions. Every kind of provider is trying to push fiber out farther into the field. So with fixed wireless, we talked about fiber to the tower. With coaxial cables from the cable company, they have nodes serving now 200, 250 homes where they have fiber to that node and then use a coaxial cable from there. Many cable companies, when they build new developments of size, are just doing fiber to the home. So this idea that cable companies use coaxial and telephone companies now traditionally use fiber to the home for their new solution, that's really changing. Everyone is using as much fiber as they can afford to invest. This fiber twisted pair copper pair, that's for DSL, and that's really an outdated technology that no one is building any new services of this kind. If they are, they're wasting their money and the government's money if they're using that. It's not really capable of meeting the state goals. And so most phone companies now, when they build new, are building fiber to the home. If you're using any kind of public subsidies, I would never recommend enhancing this these old copper telephone networks. Next.
That's it that I had.
Okay, good. So that's a lot of stuff around technology. Do people have any questions? You can either just chime in. We're a relatively small group, or go right, can go through the chat. Any comments or questions about what I covered there so quickly?
Bill, are fiber solutions still in use, really?
Oh, yes. Yeah, almost all the technology that the federal government now will fund is fiber optics. And so when they just had what they called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction, it's actually now been, kind of settled for a year. The auction ended. They really prioritize being able to providers to deliver gigabit level service. And so that fiber is really the only technology that can deliver that gigabit service. And now the fiber can actually go up to 10 gigabits of service. And so I know, Rose, in your plan, you've talked, in your housing developments to use wireless technology possibly to get to your buildings, and then using cabling inside your buildings, whether that would be fiber optics, or more likely that would be category 6 wiring, for internal networks. And that can carry those high speeds if the backbone that you're bringing, the service you're bringing to the building, is good enough. And so when I saw your application, I know you're working through that in terms with your vendor about what services are good enough. I think you need to take a hard look at saying, what are we building, and is that really going to meet the needs of our residents over the next 10 years? Because the 25.3 is really a standard that was created in 2008. And so at that time, that wasn't a bad connection. But since that time, we've seen these technologies race ahead. The 25.3 would have a hard time supporting, like if there were 2 or 3 people in an apartment and they were trying to work from home or going to school from home and doing multiple Zoom calls, you would have a hard time supporting 2 or 3 Zoom calls on that 25.3. And that's why those upload speeds are so critical now.
I think I have a collaborator here, James Ralph. James, are you listening to this?
Oh, absolutely. And, our model is a hybrid of, fiber circuit, that's expandable up to 10 gig, and to the building's Cat 6 to the Wi-Fi. So, we do have a lot of capacity to reach those speeds that Bill is talking about. And yeah, as far as 100 megabits, or if it's 50, burstable to 100, that type of infrastructure is definitely capable.
Good. That's great to hear. And it's it really is important to think about the future and what's good enough for your community. And so many times those decisions are out of the hands of the community, that the providers just come in and build what they want. But now with this involvement of either federal or state dollars, the public voice then becomes much more legitimate to say, here's what we really want in our community, and working with finding the right provider partners to ensure that is really important. Thanks for that question, Rose. Any other questions or comments or? Good. Well, now you're all experts, so that's great to hear. And thanks for that so much, everyone. Robbie, you're up next, going to talk about adoption.
All right, just 1 second. Let me do. Shoot, hold on. Okay. Can people see my screen okay? All right, I'm going to spotlight myself. Spotlight Bill. Okay. So this is kind of the fuller version of what Adrienne had mentioned earlier in her presentation. So we like to talk about the stool of digital equity, the three-legged stool of digital equity. And so that's that. I don't think that can be understated how much of a focus that is with each of these aspects. The idea being, if you only focus on one of these areas when you're thinking about the digital divide or the broadband needs of your community, you're going to be ultimately, kind of working in an uneven plane in trying to get people to be, fuller participants in their communities. So I'm in this presentation just very quickly going to be talking about that middle stool, which is the adoption component, which is, are people in my community, are they subscribing and are they able to use broadband? So within this, I like to do a little throwback, late 90s PowerPoint graphics. And so just so people are aware of some of the terms, when we say things like digital literacy, that falls into the adoption camp ultimately around, are people able to kind of just make sense of computers and devices and be able to use them in an effective way. The homework gap gets talked about, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. We refer that to kids and families that might not have internet access at home to do their schoolwork. And so obviously you're going to be at an enormous disadvantage if a teacher assigns homework to be done online and you're unable to do it. Subscription rates is definitely part of the adoption category, looking at, okay, how many people are actually subscribing to a broadband service and why are they not? And then this continuum of connectivity, you're noticing the typo there, is around just, are people using it more fluidly throughout their lives? Because I think another wrinkle in the complication when talking about the digital divide are things like mobile only households, for example, which is a huge part of the digital divide issue across the country. Are people only accessing the internet via their cell phones, which is certainly true, I think, for a lot of people, versus people that have multiple devices, a desktop computer, even just having one laptop that a family shares. It starts getting difficult. Well, how do you measure, have they adopted these technologies at home? So when we talk about the continuum of connectivity, we're talking about, are people kind of adequately able to meet the different connectivity needs that they might have through a variety of different situations? In other words, does the child have adequate internet and bandwidth and devices and literacy at home and at school? Same with people going into work and the like. So it's these are all around the adoption component. So then when thinking about barriers, access and availability, I know it can get a little bit confusing. That is still an adoption component. If it's not available or at a certain address for a variety of different reasons, that's going to affect adoption. But I wanted to mostly highlight cost, as Adrienne mentioned, that, based on our research, that's part of the disconnect that is changing at the federal level. The Benton Institute, I think, specializes in getting research out there that accurately kind of understands the digital divide. And for a long, long time, and it's still ongoing now, the conversation has always been, well, maybe it's about relevancy or it focuses on the people that don't have anything, when really it's if you want to get more people connected to the internet and all the benefits that go with it, you have to talk about the cost issue, because the reality is many people across the country, and I'm sure in the communities represented on this call, are making decisions around food or broadband or any other bills that they might have. So really, I think the adoption, you can get caught in the literacy and all these other things, but I just kind of want to emphasize every one of these communities should probably be, focusing on how can we make broadband more affordable, or how can we raise awareness of subsidies, or how can we ensure that we're accurately getting a good picture about what people are able to afford and what they are paying for broadband, whether or not it's too much. In addition to costs, perception, that kind of hits on the trust aspect. So there's a lot of hesitancy. It might be seen as unsafe. We haven't shown it yet, but if you actually look at adoption demographics, one of the more interesting ones is there's a steep drop off for seniors and anybody, in the elderly community. And I think a lot of that is ultimately around perceptions. They hear it's not really that safe. Parents might have, questions around like, is this a good thing for my child to have? All these sorts of things. So I think that speaks to the community initiative, the option stuff around really focusing on places in which people can kind of like learn to trust the benefits ultimately that can come from greater connectivity. Relevance is on here, which is very similar to perception, though less kind of like a trust thing and more about is it useful to my life? And again, I think that is certainly apparent in the elderly population, senior community of, what I don't need this. I've gone, most of my life without really needing to use this, so I don't see the relevancy. So just something to think about as you start targeting, different initiatives around your adoption goals. That relevancy ultimately may be a big barrier for certain members of the community. And then lastly, skills. Just kind of like not really understanding or having the abilities to kind of take advantage of really adopting it at home. And the other thing that I would like to say is something that's getting kind of a larger part of the conversation in the National Digital Inclusion Alliance discourse space is the kind of continuum of skill, because there's general skill of just like, are you able to use these? Are you able to go on the internet? And then from there, it's really, really a lifelong journey, including staying safe online, accessing different things. There's the skill too of just kind of like becoming a smart consumer. I remember we worked with Flanagan in round one, and there was a member of the elderly community on the steering committee who said, all these people that she talked with, her friends, her peers, didn't really realize the benefit of the available streaming options and the ability to kind of like use their television to ultimately hook into these things so that they might not have to pay enough for cable. And so I think that skill component is also a part of that, of just kind of being aware, teaching about the benefits, and being able to kind of like really learn and continue to learn and just make the internet more relevant and a bigger part of people's lives. And so I just wanted to highlight a few things that we got from round one that people kind of pointed to as this was a really, big success ultimately around the adoption. So holding a computer distribution event, we will certainly be talking about that more. We work heavily with a group called PCs for People that has a St. Louis metro area distribution center and a Chicago metro area distribution center. And so people would organize and they would hold distribution events, where people would ultimately get computers, sometimes giving out 50 computers to families in need, and overwhelmingly talking with round one participants. That was one of the most positive experiences that they had with this program, because it's just a direct injection of tackling such an obvious material divide in that front. Working with internet providers to promote the use of discount programs is huge. And a lot of people, I think, might come to the situation where they have maybe an adversarial approach, where it's like, oh, this provider hasn't been great in our community. But bringing them into the table, I think, really does open up a lot of doors. And one of the most successful programs across the country with millions of people subscribing it is Comcast Internet Essentials, which is, I think, something like a $20 per month opportunity for families with students that have on the free and $10 a month. Adrian is saying $10 a month for students that have on the free and reduced lunch program. So especially at the start of the coronavirus pandemic, the FCC kind of held this pledge, this Keep Americans Connected pledge, in which a lot of providers stepped up to ultimately offer discounts. And so working with providers to promote the use of those can really, really be a win-win for a lot of communities, and just making people aware. In a similar—
And Robbie, can I just interject? One of the things that was also interesting about that Keep Americans Connected pledge was that Comcast Internet Essentials was, before the pandemic, was offering 25 3 service, and now is offering 50 over 5. So not great still on the upload speed, but better, almost twice as good as it was before. And then they waived things like you couldn't sign up for the program if you had previous debt with Comcast. So I think many of the providers have tried to work harder to introduce these programs in such a way to help people through the pandemic. And so, yeah, I would just validate that some of them have been very helpful in Illinois.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's just something to be thinking about as well, because you can make, kind of dramatic impacts ultimately. And that's something that I know some of these communities have been talking about, the cost benefit analysis of doing Wi-Fi hotspot loaning versus these types of subsidy programs through internet service providers. You can ultimately save a lot of money, even though both are solutions ultimately to kind of particularly the homework gap. One can be much more cost effective. In a similar strain, we have creating or supporting a local broadband subsidy program. So this kind of gets into bulk purchasing for schools. It can also be agreements with different housing authorities. So working with landlords that might manage multiple properties. You can ultimately kind of get some discounts and deals through that. And I know there are some housing affiliated associations with this round too. So that's something to be looking at. Public Wi-Fi is another great opportunity, I think, to kind of build on that community trust and adoption, making people aware of different public Wi-Fi, maybe deploying public Wi-Fi with certain funds. That can be a great way also to do in-person events now that those are somewhat happening more. You can kind of get people to take advantage of the public Wi-Fi in a certain area. And then obviously training programs is a huge part of it. And so libraries will be, a big focus of that. But I think, with these types of programs, the more successful ones that we've seen are very targeted with specific populations. Like obviously you can do generic, library, training or something like that. But if you actually do kind of think about more of like, okay, where are the communities that are in most need of broadband digital literacy training, and then gearing your programming towards that, you can see a lot of really great success. And so last slide here, just some things to keep in mind. When we're talking about adoption, I think it's really, really good to just be thinking about inclusion as well. And so it's like, how are we including the communities that we want to see increase adoption in the process? And so when I talked about earlier, the perception aspect, it's kind of like, okay, how are these people able to speak about the trust issues and kind of be heard, because I think, I know in Chicago, in particular, there's, even though there were free opportunities, the history between the city and the residents was, and the distrust that existed there was a lot of skepticism about getting free, internet program, like, oh, I'm going to maybe billed later. There's a loophole, there's a catch. And so I think that strikes to making sure that inclusion with your community is of primary importance as you think about implementing any of these programs. I had mentioned the big and small wins and just kind of charting those out. I think, this is a pretty quick program. I think the time flies fast. And so there are ways to just do very small things, and just knowing that, things build, incremental progress is okay. You don't always need to think big, but at the same time, don't set your sights too small. So just kind of be thinking about that as well, when you start crafting your goals in your steering committees, thinking about big and small wins. This is probably kind of the most important thing, I think, which is just really understanding community needs and opportunities. And so that just might be expanding outside of where you normally look around adoption. And I think that's like one of the trickier aspects to all this is like doing anti-poverty work, digital divide work. I think it's challenging because you're dealing with a population that's often unheard. Apologies, all right, dog barking in the background. You're dealing with she's heard right now, but when you're dealing with these communities, they're often not overlooked, not seen, not able to express themselves, maybe historically marginalized or cast aside. So it really does require, I think, going out and really creating some strong partnerships to understand your community and what opportunities are there. So that goes with the last point as well, is about, it is about connecting your community to the internet, but it's also about relationship connecting with everybody to make sure you're really filling in the cracks as best as you can when trying to reach the digital equity outcome that your community might be targeting. So that's all for me. I think we'll pass it on. Any questions, you can put it in the chat, or I'm sure we'll have a Q&A at the end. So
good. Thanks, Robbie.
Yeah.
Any immediate questions for Robbie? I just wanted to comment that one of the things that stand out that Robbie said for me is building trust with the residents in the communities, because a lot of our communities, trust has been violated so many times. And as Robbie expressed, whenever something comes up, they think there's a catch. So digging deep and building those connections and trust is key.
Mm-hmm.
Good, thanks for that good comment. And yeah, and it's not just they don't necessarily trust the providers of the city, they might not trust anyone, right? So everyone has to build their own set of credibility, and sometimes the partners you can bring to the table to help add to your efforts credibility, I think is really important. So thanks, Rose. I had wondered how I got so far ahead on my agenda, and then I realized that I had skipped a part of it. And I'm going to call on Shabika Agarwal, and she's going to talk about the mapping of broadband services. She's our team expert on the state's mapping system. So welcome, Shabika.
Thank you, Bill. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be sharing my screen now, and I'll introduce all of you to the mapping system that we have for Illinois. So do you all see my screen here?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get started. I'm going to share the link to this later on after the demonstration. So this is what it looks like when we first access this mapping software. So I'm going to first familiarize you with the different tabs that this has. So if we look at the left, firstly, we have this access tab here, which basically gives us information about access at various different speeds and the technologies that we'll discuss, like fiber, cable, DSL, fixed wireless, mobile. And we also have information about unserved areas and density of providers. So this is the access tab here. Moving on, we have the statistic tab. This is basically all the ACS data that we have related to income, education, the subscription rates based on education age. This is where we get those layers. On the bottom left, we firstly have the general tab here, which basically has the community institutions and boundary layers. So this includes like the census blocks, county boundaries, federal lands, all the different boundary layers that we see. The next one is the federal programs tab. So this basically gives us an information of all the federal programs which have mostly been rural focused to ensure equity in rural Illinois. And this is a map. So we see the legend here on the right. These are the different programs like the Connect America funds, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, RDOF that we see here, ACAM, the different phases. So this is, I mean, this would be essential in basically seeing that what are our neighboring rural areas actually doing, who are the providers, and sort of building a community that way. Then we have the states projects tab here, which highlights some of the state projects that we have, the Connect Illinois round, which is the infrastructure funding provided by the state. And we have all of these different grantees who've received this fund for the first round. And when we click on it, we can actually see details again. So this would again be helpful in seeing if we have certain similar projects in our neighborhood, or also getting to know the different providers who are taking up these grants so that we could collaborate with them. And the other important resource here is the public hotspots that Robbie mentioned. So we have this map for the entire state, and we could actually like zoom into one of the areas, like suppose if we look at Chicago. So then we get a map of all of this, and we can like build on this as we develop and plan for different public Wi-Fi hotspots ourselves. This is on the left. Then on the right, this is a very important tool here. We have the speed test tool. So I hope most of you have taken a speed test. Ever since COVID, it's been a thing, but it's really easy. Just click on it and you're taken to the Ookla speed test website, and you just click on go. And it's going to be calculating the download and upload speeds. It just takes a few seconds here. So it's calculating my download. Seems
Excellent
like I do have
download.
a good, yeah, I was gonna say that. So I do have good speeds here. And it would be interesting to see what the upload is like.
Wow.
Yay. 5 stars from my internet provider.
I was gonna say better than mine, Shubika.
Oh, wow, okay. And this is where we get the results. So these are my speeds. I have 279 megabits of download and 168 upload, which is so much better than the standards.
So I just want to point out that Shubika, they showed your provider, that Silver IP.
Yeah.
They're one of the fixed wireless providers we talked about, when they have wireless to your building and then it's wired inside your building. And so you can see the high speeds that are possible with that kind of technology.
Yes. Okay, moving on to the map here again. Then we have the adoption tab here. This is a little under development, but this could be helpful in terms of accessing different programs by AT&T, Spectrum, Comcast, and the Lifeline programs, like the big providers there, a few information about them. And then we have a funding tab here, which has information about the federal and state programs that we had on the bottom left tab. So ACAM, RDOF, Connect America funds, and the USDA Reconnect, and all of those. So if you want more information about those programs, we have it here. And on the bottom right, we have the legend tab. That is going to be useful whenever we actually are looking at a particular layer. Suppose I do look at the 1 gigabits, sorry, 1,000, okay, yeah, 1 gigabits, all fixed. So we get that in the legend here. Then we have the query tool here. So we can actually use this to locate our particular area of interest by census block or county, economic development region, township. And I think the feature that would be useful here, so for example, if we look at identify by school districts, I know we have North Chicago School District 187. So I just type that in. And okay, this is where we see it and apply. So we get here to North Chicago School District 187, and we get a brief summary of, how many households are served by 25 by 3 and how many are served by 100 by 20. And it seems like this region does not have any provision by like for 1 gigabit, so we do not have that here. So this can be like a tool that you use to get a brief summary of, okay, how many households are served in our particular area by all of these different speeds. And then we can also add data. So the first one is basically requiring us to have an RTS online account, which might not be the case for all of us. So I'm going to skip on the URL. There are a few websites that would have that, URLs. If you add that in here, just exports the data. Or this would be essential for most of us, wherein we can actually upload a file. For example, here I have a file for economic development regions. So for a shape file, that would have to be a compressed, a zipped folder. So I upload that here and I see it here. So this is essentially like, now this could be points and things like that. For example, if we have data of, addresses where we have distributed hotspots. So that could be a layer and you could import it in here to take a closer look. So that is me taking you over the different tabs. Now let's actually see how this works. So, okay, and we also have a few things here, the standard zoom in, zoom out. This is the home extent wherein we see the entire Illinois. And this is interesting. So we are going to be talking about this a little later in the demonstration as well. We can also look at the different providers that are serving a particular area in your community. So we look at that in more detail. And this symbol here is the base map gallery. This can be used to toggle between different base maps. And that kind of depends on, what our focus is. Do we want to be looking more at streets? Or do we want to be looking at buildings? If that's the case, we look at open streets, or we could look at the terrain as well. So it has got its options based on what we really want to be looking at. And we have this tool for drawing on the map. I will be demonstrating how this could be useful. We can also measure distances on the map. This could again be useful when we're planning, how long do we want to lay our fiber and things like that. And we can also share a map with people. So these are the possibilities. So now let's probably zoom into Carrollton, which is one of our ICC round 2 communities here. So I just type it here in the search and I see city of Carrollton and here it goes. So I can zoom out to the end. So this is Carrollton. I can start with looking at access here. So I want to see if they have a 1 gigabit service, wireline. When I click that, I do not see it, implying, okay, Carrollton doesn't have 1 gigabits. Then we move on to 100 by 20. So they don't seem to have 100 by 20 wireline as well. They do have 25 by 3 wireline. So this gives us a sense. And I think I would like to point out that this is more granular than the FCC data because, even it shows that, okay, these parks here, the screen space does not have it. And there's this another symmetry area here that doesn't have it. So it's much more granular based on the data provided by the internet service providers. That is how we can look at it. And this is for the basic access. We can also look at the different technologies that we have just been mentioned earlier. So we have, let's see what kind of technology Carrollton already has. Do they have fiber? Seems like no. Do they have cable? Oh yes, they do have cable. And let's go to the legend here. So it's a lighter red here. So implying they have at least, like these regions at least have 25 by 3 megabits of cable service. Do they have DSL? Yes, part of Carrollton does. Do they have fixed wireless? Yes. So fixed wireless also includes the antenna ones, which is why it has a greater coverage than the wireline that we saw earlier. And then mobile pretty much covers the entire state. So yeah, Carrollton has that as well. We can also look at the advertised speeds here. The important thing that I'd like to show would be density of providers, because we constantly keep talking about how it's important to have some competition. So let me just see why it is not showing up here for a minute. Oh, okay. So this is for 100 by 20. So they do not have that. So we move on to 25 by 3. Yes, so now we see it. The darker green shades have like 3 providers. So now let's check on the provider tool that we had here. I can actually just drop a point onto the map using this. Oops. So this is a lighter shade of green and it has supposed to have 2 providers. And so yeah, we get a list here. So the providers that we have here are, oh, this has 4. This has quite a few providers. So it has Frontier, New Wave. Oh, we actually have a repetition of the others here. So it's Frontier and New Wave. So that is a great feature for communities who are wanting to know, who do we contact? If you do not really know who's providing in your community, this could be a starting point. And then we can look at the unserved areas, which is again a very important layer. And we can also look at the number of houses that fall under each of these areas. So right here, it tells us about what block, census block it falls in, and the total number of households in this particular census block is just 1. And so that is probably the reason why they do not have a provider there, because there's not a lot of people to serve. So that is something that might be of interest to look at. Now, let's probably look at the ACS categories, like how do we use this? So I'd like to move on to, let's get to the county level. So if we look at McHenry, for example, we can go to the Generals tab here and add the county boundaries so that we see the extent of McHenry. Yes, so this square sort of county here is McHenry. We can start by looking at their access as well. We look at wireline, 1 gigabits, 125 by 3. So we see like different 3 shades of orange here. The darkest shade of orange is basically here would be, it has all 3 of them, like 1 gigabits, 125. Then we have a lighter shade, which has just 100 by 20 and 25 by 3. And then we have the lightest shade of orange, which is just 25 by 3 service. So when we look at this, now we could also use the draw on the map tool if we want to look at other data. So for example, I want to see, seems like this is a very well-served area. So I put like a yellow pointer there, and then I maybe select a red one, and I'm like, okay, there's not so much happening up here in the north. And why is that the case? So I just put a pointer there, and you can have multiple points that way. So I just want to be looking at these areas here. And I could turn off these layers. And go to the statistics tab here. So now we can look at educational attainment. If that is, we want to look at why is there a difference? Does it relate to education? And we can see it here. So the education tab basically tells us percentage of population 25 years and over, whose highest education completed is less than high school. So the higher, like the darker the color, it means the lesser people are, like percentage of people have gone to high school in those areas. And I mean, that could be a possibility, or that's a trend that we see here. So this does not have a very good service, might relate to the education levels. We could look at income in a similar way. So we see the bluer shade as lower income, which is the case in the area which has lesser service. And I think when we talked with McHenry, we did see this east-west divide. So that is something that is confirmed in this example here. And you can look at different variables in this tab here. Yeah, one more feature that I would like to tell you about is when you add all of these layers, suppose now you want to actually save this. We also have this export map feature here. It's going to take a while to load because we have large data layers here. Yeah, so we can just set the format, what format we wanted in. I think PDFs or JPEG work best. We can set the extent of our export and just click on print and it'll export it for us. So a lot of possibilities here. This was a short tutorial on what we can do, and I hope this was helpful. I am happy to answer any questions that we may have. I hope everybody was able to follow as well. Yeah.
Shabika, that was great. That was really clarifying and so much information in there. I have to say my own use, I tend to not go as deep and combine those multi-factors of the demographics plus the broadband, but it's very, very clarifying and I think great to see.
So
thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think Matt Schmidt should never give a presentation on the maps again, Shubika, because you really know this. Hey, Bill, maybe you might explain to the communities on the phone whether Shubika is available to help them or how we're going to use this map as we go forward with the Illinois Connected Communities program.
Yes, so at the second meeting of the steering team, Shubika and Adrienne are combining to present a wealth of maps and data for each of our communities. And so that will be news to you to see some of these things. Others will be, maybe it'll be show what you already have seen or know. I think that's one of the beautiful things is people have all these perceptions about what the broadband is or isn't. And these maps are a good way to test that and to clarify questions and so on. Know that the maps are based on data that the providers deliver. And so it's important for the communities to kind of verify that information and make sure that it is accurate because many, many funding decisions are based on what's in the maps. And so organizing to either verify or to correct the maps is a big part of this. So that's so we're going to do, it'll essentially be a chapter in your plan what Adrienne and Shubika will produce here in the next upcoming weeks. Good. I think Shubika is everything with these maps. I think people get a little stunned. But I think one of the beautiful things is that it can go in, easy access to that. Could you put the address in the chat? And then if you ever need help, Shubika is available to, if you want to call her or email, that would be, she's at your service.
That's right. And I'm going to share my details in the chat as well if anybody wants to reach out.
Good. Very good. Well, thanks, Shubika.
Sure.
And then
Thank you,
we've got one more presentation. I'm going to talk about use. And if Robbie wants to show my presentation. And sometimes use is an interesting kind of thing. In many and I think I look at this a little differently than kind of many in the community broadband field. And a lot of people think use is okay. Well, how can individuals use it to improve their life? And I definitely agree with that. And I think a lot of, it's interesting how the difference between adoption, which kind of talks about skills training and so on, and use. Some people put all that in one kind of continuum that, okay, we've got people an email address and they know how to Google something and maybe fill out a form, and then added skills onto that, like coding and kind of things they include that as well as more of the digital equity kind of side. But I'd like to think about use as community economic development and community vitality, that a community having invested in these networks get to realize the full value from that connectivity, and really thinking about transforming the community to be globally competitive. Next. And so, we work at this, the network is in place and residents have affordable broadband and appropriate skills and devices. Really it's so what, now what? How do we make sure that this makes a difference to your community? And people have heard me talk about an exercise bicycle in my basement. That's my infrastructure, that's my device kind of thing. But I need to get on that bike and ride like crazy to get any value from it. And I think that's the same truth with the internet, that we want to make sure that people are getting the value from that and that the communities get the value. Next. So here's a nice graphic that Robbie provided, the connected community. And you can see that there's telework on here and police and data in terms of crime solving, schools using online resources, libraries connecting residents to education, e-government service, traffic, so on. You can go through that list of activities. And I wanted to talk, many of these things, when you think about, okay, how's government going to use technology? That's kind of a top-down approach. School districts hear from the state how they're going to use technology and so on. But I'd like to think about what's the real role that communities can play, community organizations like our ICCs, in helping to transform the community. So next one. So here's the opportunity, I think, is to transform the way these services are delivered in high quality, globally competitive services. And many times people don't think about that as the bar, globally competitive services. They think, oh, what's good enough, or what can our poor little town do? But I think in this day and age, because of the online resources that are out there, many of them free tools, that we can really change our communities. Next. So I just have some opportunities here that I thought about today, and over the years I've thought about when we think about telehealth. And obviously, if you're in a community and you've got a big, multi-location healthcare system in your town, whether it's Mayo Clinic or University of Chicago or whoever the big providers are in your region, there's not a lot you can do as a community group and knock on their door and say, yeah, you guys should be doing more telehealth stuff. And, that's not likely to have a lot of impact. But if you think about your own county public health or community-oriented healthcare organizations, there are things. And we've leaped so far forward with the pandemic in the use of technology. I think it's great to think about how can we continue this on in the future. And so I think about online home visits by health agencies and volunteers. New mothers and older adults certainly come to mind as folks that could use a visit, probably use some help. And the idea that you're not sending a letter, you're not actually having to get in the car and drive to a place, but you can make many of these visits per day. One concept I love to promote, I've been promoting for a long time, is just peer-to-peer senior networking circles, that if you had in your neighborhood or in your town or county you think about groups of, in this, I always think about older women, about, they're living by themselves in their homes. And so who's checking in on them every day? I'm Facebook friends with one of my friend's mothers, and she's quite the presence, but every day when she wakes up, she posts something on Facebook, some graphic says, hey, the sun is shining, and at night she posts, night, essentially. That's messaging. That's really to one of her friends that they're both okay. And so they check in on each other. But I think there's great opportunity to expand that to groups of 6 or 8. And, if Helen doesn't look so good on a Friday morning, maybe somebody else in the call will say, hey, I'm going to contact her daughter and let her daughter know that her, mom might need some help. I think that there is opportunity to partner with systems and say, hey, our community is ready to do these kind of applications. We've got outreach, training networks to support these things. And then finally, this group, Keros Alive, they're active here in Minnesota. They actually do Zoom online dance halls and kind of exercise courses. Some of them are intergenerational, and some of them are just older adults. But movement and music brings joy to people, and they've got really demonstrated results that it's a lot of fun. So they do these all over the country now. A good, great group of people doing that work. Next, we think about community education. I think we can use technology to enable easier volunteer opportunities, whether it's older adults tutoring latchkey kids after school, or school partnerships with businesses and colleges for advanced tutoring. If you think of in the Chicago metro area, there's thousands of college students who know math, they're experts in that, or science. You're able to zoom right into people's homes or into the school buildings themselves, and think of that experience that with in a half an hour or a couple times a week of total time, those students could impact students very positively. I think we could do the same things with businesses that you have in your area. Again, the ability of technology to jump immediately into a classroom without getting hall passes or maybe even background checks or things. I think there's just opportunities for that kind of collaboration. I've told communities around the country that I've worked with that I would love to see someone say, we set the goal to have the world's best schools, right? We're in X community, X county. And I think with the availability of online content now, there's, whether it's Khan Academy, simple things like that, that goes up to the advanced, or MIT has tons of information online, that you could really, a willing group of teachers and students really change the world in that community by accessing these online tools. And I think it's an extraordinary resource that's out there. Some of these things in some communities would really benefit from the parents going to school. A lot of parents, we have new Americans where they don't necessarily have a high level of education. Khan Academy, some of these other online programs, parents could sit with their kids and go through these things, and both parents and kids could learn together and really build an education base on which to build a better career. And then I think the same thing about schools and public libraries, that now we can order books online from almost any library in the country. But how many kids, especially in lower income communities, really understand that possibility? And again, rewarding this family participation and achievement, I think, is really has real possibilities. And next. And then local business opportunities, creating a business portal for your community businesses, getting them all in one place, essentially an online mall. These are some of these concepts came in very early in the first of the internet. And now it's quite easy to put up a web page and have links to local businesses. and so on. And so to kind of work as a group, as businesses in the community to serve the community and maybe even external markets, real opportunity there, using social media. And then I also think there's opportunity in a community. Everyone wants everything right now. So order it online, pick it up at the store, get it next day with Amazon Prime. Well, if you have 10 or 12 businesses that, they could hire a local van driver to come and pick up product and deliver, 2 or 3 times a day. People could have product from the local Ace Hardware store or the restaurant or any number of places in a community. All it takes is people working together. These online tools are all out there and available. Even with something as simple as Google Docs, where if a business gets an online order, they go to their community Google Docs delivery page and start typing in, stop at my store and pick up something and bring it to a particular place. It's not much of a technology challenge. And next. So this is my general advice on use as you think about this for your community. How can we use technology to solve problems and gain competitive advantage? And as we think about that for use, I think that a lot of great ideas will come up. Some of them are at little to no cost and so on. Robbie, I think I skipped one on government. There we go. Use networks that we're building to institute small city applications for traffic, utilities, and safety. We saw that on that fancy graphic that we had earlier in this session. But there's also online polling tools to get ongoing feedback from community members. A company called Polco, Polco, offers a free suite of services for local government. And then again, just using communication tools, whether that's auto texting or websites or any number of things to let residents know about what's going on in the community. I think a lot of people would sign up, be very interested in keeping better track of that, and especially tied to these polling survey tools as a meaningful way to participate in community. So just going back then to that advice, how do we use these? How do we look at, get our community to think culturally about using technology as a problem-solving strategy? And again, the more one sector uses the technology in your community, the more likely it is to spill into the other sectors and really be mutually self-supporting. So I encourage you to try and bring that attitude, get your mayors and county board members to think about that, as well as leaders of your schools and chamber and so on, to just think, as a first step, how can we think about the latest technology to do these things? So that's my use mini lecture today. Any questions on the maps or on broadband access adoption and use, or our project or our process that we're going to be going through? We are recording this session, and so it's available. You'll get an email later today or first thing tomorrow about where you can find the link to that for this on YouTube. We're also doing this again at 6 o'clock tonight. Last time we had equal audiences between the afternoon and the evening session. So hopefully we'll have another good group tonight and get your community members on board. Adrienne, do you have any closing today?
Well, I always just love thanking everybody for being here, for taking a couple of hours out of a busy day to attend. I want to congratulate the team. I love the way Bill got everybody on the ICC team to present today. And I have to say, Adrienne, I've never used that that sticky board. I think that's a lot of fun. That's something I could adopt and use. And Shabika, thank you very much for that amazing mapping demonstration. And I'm sure the communities are looking forward to you drilling down in their particular areas to look at that. And as always, Bill, thanks for organizing Robbie and me to present, and looking forward again, everyone, to working with you and your communities over the course of the next 8 or so months. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a question in the chat about how to demonstrate that an area is served or unserved. And I think that a couple things. One is that many telecom providers on their ordering system actually have if they are delivering DSL service, which is where most of the area in dispute lies. If you go there, many of those will show you the speed that they say they can deliver. And so that would be doing that with an address or multiple addresses, and screenshotting the results of that, I think, would be a powerful tool to use to refute the mapping. The other is to use the mapping tool, the speed test on the website. And that Ookla is pretty well regarded as a relatively neutral one. Maybe speeds are higher than some people would say, but I think generally well regarded. And ask a bunch of people in an area to do that speed test and to send you the results, I think is another great way to do that. And then to make your case, to contact the Office of Broadband, and actually Shabika is kind of taking a lead on a lot of the mapping right now, but ultimately that's Matt Schmidt, who's the director of that. But build your case, and so I think the speed test and then those speed ordering systems from providers can help you make the case. There is like a cable modem service. They generally won't offer that kind of what speed is available on their website, but not that I've seen. So that's a little harder, but the speed test would work for that. So with that, I bet half of you will say this was so much fun. We'll see you tonight at 6 o'clock. But certainly if you're one of the coordinators, let your teams know that it was hopefully a worthwhile experience to join in, and you can compare notes. But thank you. And Nancy, thanks so much for recording and hosting us from Illinois.